What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Uncensored Critic podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Thank you, as always, for your time. Today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome along a amazing director, actor, director, associate director, writer, and dramaturg. Someone who's been involved with actors is probably what I meant to say, and that is Mr. Jeff James, a man with an extraordinary amount of credits to his name. And I'll just give you a few little samples of what he's done. And this is just a small little sample of what he's done. So Jeff has been a associate director with A View from the Bridge, Hedda, Gabler, The Changeling, and A Little Life, an assistant director for Macbeth at the Globe with Lucy Barley, Uncle Vanya at the Minerva Theatre in Chichester with Jeremy Herrin, Antigone at the Barbican, Luxembourg, Amsterdam, and of course that goes with his long-standing collaborations with Ivo Van Hove. As a director, he has been involved in A Winter's Tale, a retelling of that in a modern sense, which had its opening production in Latvia. Persuasion at the Rose Theatre in Kingston, also as a writer, and new play Shooting Hedda Gabler at the Rose Theatre, which was on last year. And as a writer, he has written An Evening in Taglioni, Stinkfoot from Sophocles, and which is all thing. And as a dramaturg, he has, how do you say this ballet? Is it Coppelia?
Coppelia.
Coppelia, thank you. Coppelia at the Edinburgh Fringe and Richard II at the Almeida with a certain Simon Russell Beale. And that's just a small sample of Jeff's CV. Hello, Jeff.
Hello. Great to see you, Oliver.
Yeah, great to see you, man. Hey, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, enjoying the summer.
Yes, well, what summer exactly? We have 1 minute of sun and 1 minute of rain. Welcome to the UK, guys. So we start at the beginning with every starter question. Where did it all start for you, Jeff? The love of the arts and directing, where did it come from?
I think looking back now, I can kind of trace it to when I was a child, when I was really a kid at like ages like 7, 8, 9, and remembering building these kind of imaginary worlds with my friends. And even now I kind of remember that some of the detail of these kind of big imagined worlds, and there was this I remember at primary school in the lunch break we would talk about these aliens who we were friends with, who were called the Alfies, and then there were these like villains who the Alfies and we were like trying to fight and defeat, led by this kind of evil genius called Nakatang. And it was this very kind of complex universe, is perhaps overstating it, but it was this, there was quite a lot of lore involved. And I remember leading my friends through that and kind of really being the instigator for these stories. And the thing that really sort of echoes down to my work today is this feeling I had of, I guess, of responsibility for kind of leading that story, but also an anxiety about whether my friends realized it wasn't true. And that I did know it wasn't true, I think, but I remember being so involved in it and caught up in it with my friends, and occasionally having this feeling of, do they really realize it's not real? And I think that kind of leading a group of people in creating a story and creating a kind of compelling narrative is obviously, you know, absolutely still what I'm doing today. And also that kind of interesting and difficult boundary line between reality and fiction, I think I'm still really interested in. And in my work today, I'm often, you know, I'm often kind of pushing at that boundary and very interested about where that is. It's something I think about a lot. I had this slight pickle I got into. Actually, no, it wasn't a pickle. I had this slight conflict I got into when I was making a show last year that had a real shower in it. And the shower was at the center of the stage, but it was covered. There was a shower curtain in front of it, which was opaque, and so the actors could go into the shower and have a shower. And during the show, I think 3 or 4 of the actors went and had a shower. And there was some anxiety from the theatre about whether this counted as nudity on stage, about whether the actors were having to take their clothes off on stage, and would need like a nudity rider. And I think all of those kind of protocols are really useful and important.
Yeah.
I felt it wasn't nudity on stage because the audience weren't able to see them.
Hmm.
But one of the suggestions from the people I was working with was why do they have to take their clothes off? Why do they have to have a shower? Why can't they just turn the shower on and stand next to it? Or why can't we just have a sound effect of a shower? Why do we need the running water? And I think having some kind of anchors of reality on stage uh, are really useful. It's a really useful thing to have, because we're creating this kind of fictional world. And of course, as I guess was the same with my friends 30 plus years ago, the audience know it's not real. They're sat in the dark often. Um, they understand the convention that there's these group of people playing stuff out on the stage in front of them, and they're not expecting to read that as reality. But it also has a relationship to reality. And one of the reasons why I really love theatre um, is when it's good, I think it can really kind of feel like it is exposing or depicting truth in a way that other art forms do as well, but in a very particular way.
Mm.
Um, and I think those kind of boundaries between reality and fiction are so interesting. And I had a similar again, slight conflict with the theatre I was working with in Riga recently, which they totally, in both cases actually, they accepted my arguments and I got what I wanted, so I really shouldn't complain about it. But in this case, I wanted there to be a real baby on stage.
Ah.
The show is about somebody. So this is Winter's Tale, and it's about uh, a man who's about my age who is having his second child, and he mistakenly believes that the baby isn't his, that it's the father is the real paternity is his best friend. Um, and there's this moment in Shakespeare's play and in my version of it where this character Leontes in Shakespeare, or Leo in my version, is confronted by the baby, who is his daughter, and he can't deal with that. And and I'm sure I'm not the first person to do this with The Winter's Tale, but I thought having a real baby would be much more powerful than having a doll, for example.
Mm.
And there was quite a lot of kind of questioning from the theatre about why couldn't it be a doll? And I think having that kind of reality effect on stage, of saying this thing is real, it is a real baby, it is a real shower, really anchors everything else. And I think what I don't like in theatre is when we try and trick the audience. Like I really don't need everything to be reality. I don't like realism or naturalism. I want magic, as they say in Streetcar Named Desire. But I think having these kind of anchor points of reality is also really important. So that kind of, yeah, as I say, I think that borderline between reality and fiction is something that I can trace back to those games and
Yeah.
imaginings in the playground as a child.
Yeah. So where do you think the boundary between reality and fiction is now?
I think it's always at play in a show, and I think that's what's so fun about theatre is that for me it's like a much less realistic form than film and television. And I think if you want, my feeling is if you want to uh, do naturalism, like you can recreate the world in a kind of photorealistic way on film and TV, and that
Mm.
works really well. And that is um, the absolute dominant mode of film and TV, isn't it? We're so used to seeing like a pretended reality on screen. Um, and I find it much more interesting in theatre to work more expressionistically, that what you're seeing isn't literally reality or pretending to be reality. It's a much more, in my work, always really a much more abstracted space.
Mm,
It's a space that's saying this is a theatre, this isn't reality. It's abstracted in some way. So for example, in my production of Persuasion, um, it played out on this white plinth. So it was this kind of this abstract space, and it was sort of um, like a petri dish or an arena for examining these people, and you could see how their choices, how their personalities and characters played out and interacted with each other.
mm,
Um, and I think that can often be really useful and interesting. And often in the last two shows as I've made, I think I've sort of the show starts in a more naturalistic place and then moves into a more expressionistic world. So that was certainly the case with Shooting Hedda Gabler,
mm,
Nina Siegel's play, which I directed last autumn, where we started in something that could be read um, in some ways as like a naturalistic film studio. It was still really quite abstracted, and actually we
mm,
used so this was working with Rosanna Weiss, the scenographer.
mm,
Um, we used the kind of architecture of the theater, but it had, there were like little tables where cameras were arranged and the sort of equipment for making a film, because the show is set in a film set. And as I say, there was this shower. Um, but then it became more abstract. And in the last part of the show, we had this big effect where green drapes fell over all of the set in this kind of a bit like this artist Christo, who wraps buildings in fabric. And by the end of the show, we were in this much more abstracted space.
mm. So I suppose that's a good lead on to, one thing I really like to ask about directors is like the journey from day one to sort of opening night, really, because
Yeah.
you mentioned there, Venter's Tale and Shooting Hedda Gabler as well. So like for you, when you're like the commander in chief of a production, what's like your unique like director's process from day one where you're sort of meeting and it's the table read to opening night, and of course it goes on longer after that, but like that process from rehearsal to the theater to the show, what's it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as the director, that first day of rehearsal is very much like not day one of what you're doing, because you've got such a long, as I'm sure you've got such a like long lead in
Mm,
for that. And for me, the work, um, if I'm writing it, that work of adaptation and working with my creative team. So, working with the designer, in the case of Shooting Hedda Gabler, working with the playwright Nina, over many months leading up to that first day of rehearsal. And I think one of the things you need to try and do in that rehearsal period is to take the actors on the journey that you've already started, kind of thing. So they're starting, they will have some sort of relationship with material on day one, but it won't be that deep yet normally. So I think it's part of what you have to do in rehearsal is take them on the journey you've already started, and sort of
mm,
repeat that with them and make sure they understand the world of the play and what is important, and what meanings are being created, I suppose. I mean, I think for me, I find, I often in that first week of rehearsal will do some kind of world building exercises, some kind of quite playful, improvisational kind of exercises. I remember on Shooting Hedda Gabler, which is set in Norway, and we had one actor who was Norwegian, and actually one of the other actors, Anna Anderson, was half Danish, but everyone else was British, and um, didn't have that much knowledge of Norway. And on one level, you can kind of say, well, you didn't really need to know anything about Norway to be in this show or to watch this show. But I wanted to kind of find a way to explore what Norway was. But I've actually never been to Norway. It was a shame during the lead up to that rehearsal process. I got invited to Norway a couple of times because it was a co-production with the Norwegian Ibsen Company. But because I was about to have my second child, I didn't feel able to leave the country, so that was a shame. But I wanted to take the actors on some sort of exercise that explored what is Norway. So we did this Welcome to Norway exercise, which took like an afternoon or something. And so in the show, I think there's 6 people in the show, 6 characters, and 2 of them are Americans and 4 of them are Norwegian, the characters. So the 4 Norwegian characters, or the actors playing them, came up with like a series of sort of Norwegian sightseeing activities that we could attempt to recreate in the rehearsal room and around. So there was stuff like having drinks at the Opera House, which we were at Mount View, and we went up to the bar on the roof to do that, and skiing, and they like made some cardboard skis, and visiting the kind of sculpture garden, and the actors kind of tried to recreate some of these sculptures, and then the Antonia and Avi, who were playing the American characters, arrived and were sort of greeted by a concierge, and who then like allowed them to kind of pick out of a hat a number, and then they went and did that activity. So the other actors had kind of created this game for them where there were maybe 15 different activities. And they would pick something out of the hat and they would go and do the skiing or something. And there was stuff like the actors were like throwing like bits of paper at them as if it was snow and stuff. So it was really silly. And the reason I'm describing it in detail is I think I quite often do something quite a bit like that. And I would really defend it because, and there was, I think at the end of rehearsals, maybe Christian Rubeck, who's this brilliant actor who played Henrik in the play, who is the one who is Norwegian. He was saying at the end, so that was like on day 3 of rehearsal or something, and he was saying at the end of rehearsal, actually it was probably on day 5 of rehearsal because it would have been on the Friday afternoon. He was saying at the end of rehearsal, when we were doing that, I was thinking, Jesus Christ, why is the director making us do this? This is such a time. Christian, I think, was performing on stage in English for maybe the first time or since drama school he's done that. I can't remember, but he's done it more recently. But I think he was very stressed about learning his lines, basically, because he's Norwegian. English is his second language. He speaks it perfectly, but he had lots of anxiety. And he was like, why are we wasting our time doing this? And then by the time he told that, I mean, I could kind of tell in the exercise that there was a tiny bit of that, even though he was very professional and very up for it. But he was saying at the end of rehearsals, that actually that exercise kind of created a kind of theatricality and a playfulness between us. But even though it didn't, what they learned about Norway, it's quite hard to see how that would like actually affect their performance. But that playfulness and that theatricality really did affect their performance, I think. And I think also as a kind of statement of intent about like what the production would be like. I mean, that production, it's about kind of the way power is expressed in making a film, in making a show, and it's kind of quite dark in some ways. But it's also I always say in rehearsal, maybe this is too silly, or let's go for it, let's try it anyway. So I'm always kind of pushing at the boundary of too silly. I think I quite like that
Mm,
space. Um, and I think doing an exercise like that gave us a license to do that. And I
mm,
think, and I often try and build an exercise like that towards the beginning of rehearsal, because so much of the rest of rehearsal, I'm basically just working through the show from beginning to end,
mm,
um, working out how to stage it. Because I feel like even when you have I had nearly 7 weeks of rehearsals to do Winter's Tale, which was, really generous and a
mm.
lot more than you'd normally get in the UK.
Yeah, that's great.
Even then, like, you just don't have very much time really. And so I think you do, and particularly on that because it's a new play and big chunks of Winter's Tale I rewrote during rehearsal. So we would rehearse scenes, long sections, and then they would change completely a few weeks later. So I do think actually deciding how you're going to stage the play is like a really important thing to do in
Mm,
rehearsal.
yeah,
And obviously everyone believes that, but quite I think in some processes I've been involved with as an assistant or that I've heard about, you spend a lot of time maybe sitting around a table talking about what things mean.
yeah.
I don't find that very I don't find that very interesting, actually. I just get a bit bored doing that.
Yeah.
So I find it much better to start playing it, to start building a shape with the actors, and definitely to kind of have those conversations when you need to, um, but as much as possible, just kind of keep moving forward, getting the thing on its feet, working out what meaning is being created, and helping the actors shape their performances, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely helpful because I remember listening to something about, obviously if something goes on tour or something, you're there as part of the spirit of wherever you're going. So you've brought like the spirit of Norway into the room in a way. So
Yeah, yeah,
so everyone's getting like a sense or like a vibe of Norway in them one way or another. They might like yourself. I've never been to Norway, so I have no idea
yeah,
what
yeah,
I don't know what's well, but what happens there, I don't know. But you get an insight into how. I remember when I did so when I did my A level drama, we basically had to devise a piece around Chile and Augusto Pinochet.
mm,
I've never been to Chile. I didn't know anything about
yeah,
Pinochet, but no, but they put us all in a room similar to what you did actually. They put pictures on the wall. They put like little bits of like food, the stuff that you'd find in Chile in the corner. There was a video playing all about South America and stuff, like some like really nice areas and then some really dark areas, which, of course, anyone who knows about
yeah,
Pinochet at
yeah,
that time was, it was horrendous. He's up there with Hitler and Mussolini and stuff. He was an evil, evil man. But yeah, that brings it all into perspective, really, which is great. You mentioned there about Winter's Tale, which we'll get onto the nitty gritty of that in just a
yeah,
second. But you mentioned there, like, because you were the writer for it as well. Like, you come into the first day of rehearsals with like your initial script,
yeah.
and then by the end of it, like you said, big chunks of it had to be rewritten and stuff. I mean, does that when someone said maybe we have to change this bit, or it might have been yourself who thought maybe I have to change it,
Yeah.
but is it like, no, I really like that bit. I wrote that for a reason. I don't want to give that up. Was there an element of that, or is it a case of no, yeah, maybe we have to do things a bit differently?
It's interesting. It's not really like that, I don't think. I
Okay.
mean, and that's what's quite fun. I really enjoy working with a writer who's not me. Like, I had a great time
Oh,
working
that's
with
great. Yeah.
Siegel on shooting Hedda Gabler. What's the good thing about writing it yourself is when you realize that something doesn't work, you don't have to convince someone else that it doesn't work. You're just like, yeah, well, this doesn't work. Let's change this. And I think maybe because I don't think of myself primarily as a writer. I always kind of think of myself first as a director. Um, I don't think I am uh, particularly like precious about the writing, but I also think Nina, uh, Nathaniel Price, who I worked with a couple of years ago, and other playwrights, I think they have a very kind of practical sense of what works on stage, and they are I think very up for like changing things and cutting things. Um, it just has to be more of a conversation, obviously, if you're not the writer yourself. Um, but I definitely find the text evolves hugely during rehearsal.
Mm,
Um, I mean, on Winter's Tale, a large part of it, I totally the second half was unrecognizable, I think, from the first from what we started with in rehearsal. And that's different, and that does have a cost to the actors. I think definitely when I'm changing stuff in rehearsal, the actors are much more stressed out by that than I am. I think that's true. I think they're always more stressed out than a playwright as well. I mean,
mm,
because I think for them, they're building this journey through the show, and when you're changing the material, changing what that journey is, that's difficult for them, and I totally understand that. Um, but no, so I don't. It's funny because it is difficult to write stuff, or it's like, it's a process. You have to sit and do it. Um, and you do have to generate. I find I have to write a lot of stuff and then cut lots of stuff before I
mm.
get to the final thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's, as they say in theatre, it's like kill your darlings or something.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I definitely have had those moments lots of times, where it doesn't feel like something is working or is right, um, and you have to kill your darlings. But I think that's off. I don't know. I feel like that's more often been a kind of staging idea or an image than with text, actually.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's all a development process, I think, in the end, because there's it's like I just get this image of a writer coming into rehearsal with this script that they're really happy with, and someone goes, "Yeah, we have to change that," and they're going, "No, I don't want to change that. I really like it, but I suppose for the overall picture, I suppose it's necessary, really, and no, it's okay to change things in a way." And I think I think one show that really captured me was something I've talked a lot about in the show was Prima Facie, and I was lucky enough to see Susie Miller do a live podcast recording a couple of months ago, and she talked about exactly the same thing as you. She brought this play into rehearsals, and she would have had Jodie Comer on stage for like 6 hours if the whole thing went in
Yeah, yeah.
unedited. So they went, okay, right, what can we do? So I think, and she said in the show, actually, the podcast she did is the Guilty Feminist one. She said, she said, kill your darlings. But for me, I don't say that. I say, right, I'm going to take my darlings, I'm going to leave them in the car park, and then we'll come back to the car park at some point. But she also added, but we never went back to the car park. There's so
Yeah,
many things I didn't pick up on. Was there anything left in the car park for you that you wished that had made it in, or do you want to save that for another project, do you think?
I think no, I think that I think it's a bit like life. It's like the way it works out is the way it has to work out, and
Yeah.
however, whatever sort of circuitous journey you've gone on to get there. Um, yeah, I mean, I remember some deleted scenes from Persuasion and from Winter's Tale, and I think that, yeah, you realize later that they weren't necessary, they weren't useful.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose, yeah, in the end, it's like, okay. And then once you get actors actually saying it and then you get it up, it's like, okay, right, I get it now. I get it. But
Yeah, yeah, hopefully, yeah.
yeah, of
That's the
course.
hope.
Yeah, so you sent me a link to one of your shows, Persuasion,
Yeah,
which I really really enjoyed. Congratulations on that, mate.
thank you.
It's an adaptation, of course, of Jane Austen's text and everything, and similar to what I've sort of seen with Winter's Tale. Really, is that you appear to have this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for one thing that jumped out at me right away was the way you liked your storytelling techniques. You're on that bare stage. You said it was like a petri dish or something just a
Mhm.
few minutes ago. It reminds me a lot of Grotowski and his notions of poor theatre. For anyone who doesn't know, Grotowski was a practitioner and he coined this term poor theatre, where essentially at its core he wanted theatre to simply tell stories without the elaborate costumes, without the fancy lighting and all the technology, and just tell theatre in its purest form and just trust the language. So that's what jumped out at me. Has that ever been something that you've worked with, or was that just a happy
I don't,
accident?
it's not something I know very much about, to be honest, Ollie.
Okay.
Think I think in Persuasion, my idea was to kind of definitely to strip things back, so
Mm,
that there was um I felt that there was a very clear idea people had of how Jane Austen novels should be staged, that was partly um, through the way they had been staged in theatre, but mainly through the very successful television adaptations that had been produced in the UK, starting with the Pride and Prejudice, starring Jennifer, I never know how to say her name, Early, how do you say her name? And
no,
Colin, um,
yeah,
and in like 1995, I think that was,
mm,
which is still,
yeah,
30 years later, is still like a really famous um, adaptation. And the I guess the thing I was interested in was that Jane Austen seemed to be absolutely sealed into this kind of idea of costume and class, basically.
yeah,
That it was about that her novels were about posh people in uh like period costume, like bonnets and empire line dresses, and that you could recognize a kind of Jane Austen story from a photograph just from the costumes, basically.
mm,
And that this was really entrenched. And I was, I think the thing maybe you're identifying is this feeling of wanting to strip it back and to
yes,
take away those bonnets and the period costume, um, and get to what I felt was the heart of the story. And I read Persuasion about 10 years ago now, probably, for the first time, wondering if it could be a play, a show. Um, and I'd just done the I'd done a couple of shows by that point, or the last two things I'd done had been European texts where the response from critics and maybe a bit from audience as well, I'm not sure, had been, oh, well, this text is quite weird and European and odd. And they were actually, both those projects I'm thinking of were quite odd texts, because one was this very obscure Sophocles play called Philoctetes,
mm,
which I adapted into this play Stinkfoot. And also this Marguerite Duras play called La Musica, which I directed at the Young Vic in 2015, I think. Uh, and La Musica is a really beautiful play, but it's quite odd in that it's this two-hander and it's a love story. It's about this couple who have got divorced and are basically seeing each other for the first time post their divorce after about 3 or 4 years.
mm,
Um, and it's got this very interesting formal innovation in it where the play sort of repeats itself. So you have this encounter between the two people, and then Duras basically kind of repeats the same story in a sort of more abstracted, boiled down form. And I think in my production, I found a really interesting way of addressing that, so that the two halves of the play had quite a different form. And in the first half, the actors were very removed from the audience, and they were on a so it was in the Maria studio at the Young Vic, and it
mm,
was sat on a platform that we built just by there's a real window in the Maria, which normally is obviously closed when people are doing plays in there, but we opened it, and so these two characters were just staring out the window. um and we had two very small cameras that were trained on their faces. So although the actors were facing away from you, uh, there were these huge screens next to them where you could see their faces. So you
Okay.
had this kind of photorealistic, up close kind of view of their emotion as they were talking about these very painful experiences in their lives. And so for the first half of the show, that was the form. And then in the second half, they we brought in this scissor lift, like you might find on a building site.
Yeah.
So drove in, sort of beeping, and because the platform didn't have any way of escaping from it, which was kind of a metaphor, obviously, for their relationship. So this scissor lift came in, and they got onto the scissor lift, and came down. And then we also asked the audience to move. So the audience had been in this very kind of end-on presentational rows of seats and up on a balcony as well. And we asked them to move down into the round. Ulz designed this. And then we sat in this little square as an audience, and they were kind of sat with us, and it was this much more immediate in the round kind of staging where you were right next to their bodies when previously they've been very removed from you.
Yeah.
So I think I was really happy with that form, but the play is quite odd. So anyway, I'd got to this point where I felt people kept saying, "Oh, well, this text is quite odd," and they weren't really seeing what I was doing as the director, because they were sort of stopping at the point where, like, oh, this is some weird European thing by this French person or by this, ancient Greek guy. This is all quite weird. And I sort of wanted them I wanted to be the weird one, I guess, in the show. And I thought, what is a kind of, I said I wanted to do something really English, something that the English critics couldn't say, oh, this is something from another country, so I don't really understand it. I don't really need to understand it.
You could bring your Norwegian ways to it or something.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I got to that later. And then I thought, what is, and I was also very interested in adapting a novel. So I'd adapted this Sophocles play into Stingfoot, and I enjoyed doing that. But I was interested in staging a novel and doing the adaptation myself. And I read Persuasion because I thought, who is more English than Jane Austen, really? Like, this kind of seems like a very sort of specific, partly because of what I'm saying about the class and about the costumes, but it feels like very specific sort of ground zero of Englishness. And reading it, I just thought it was amazing. I mean, it's, I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but she's an incredible writer. Really. Those novels are amazing. Right. And reading Persuasion, I thought that it was less about class, really, and much more about how you should organize your life. And it felt like that she was kind of asking questions about who you should choose to live with, who you should have children with, whether you should have children. And she was treating those questions really seriously.
Yeah. And
I think people kind of dismiss her because she's writing about relationships and about the upper class, or about like posh girls and stuff like that, maybe. But I think she takes these questions of how should I organize my life really seriously. And I was at a sort of point in my life where the people around me were kind of getting engaged, getting married, starting to think about having babies. And it felt very alive to me, those kinds of questions, and also the kind of material questions that she engages with, about where are you going to live and where are you going to get money from? And I think once you think about it like that, it's much more interesting than these young women who are trying to marry a posh guy, because you realize that if they don't marry the posh guy, they've got a kind of genuine anxiety about their sort of material well-being. And so the way that she deals with money and marriage, I just thought was brilliant and really interesting. But I thought it's quite hard to see that if you keep the frocks and the period costume. And I think, like, I don't think I've ever directed a play with period costume in, and
Yeah.
I don't think I'm that interested in it. Because I think that when you're staging a play, when you're asking people to come and sit there for the evening, you do need to answer the question of why now? Like, what has this got to say to our moment today? Um, and I think it's I feel it's like too easy if the costume is from 100 or 500 years ago to feel that this doesn't concern us. This is just something we can watch and we're not affected by. We don't
Yeah.
have any skin in the game. Um, and I do, I'm far from the first person to do this, obviously, but like I do think that having costume that is contemporary really helps in that kind of question of like why now? And that's something I have um repeatedly done. And that's not, I don't think that's quite the same as with Grotowski, as I understand. I don't know much about Grotowski at all, but like I think
Yeah.
it's about, yeah, saying this is now, this is contemporary. And with Persuasion, what I chose was that everything you saw was from the 21st century. So you didn't see anything that was a reminder of the early 18th century when it's set in 1814, I think. And but in the text there were reminders of the early 19th century. So what, obviously, Clueless is this really brilliant adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, Emma, into the late 20th century in that case. Um, and that wasn't what I was doing, because I was interested in the show existing in both times at the same time, so that it was both
Yeah.
the 18th and the early 19th century and today, and that you saw that kind of jostle between those two things, and you could see the ways in which the lives of these people on stage was different to our lives, but also how it was incredibly relatable and interesting, and didn't I do think the love story of Anne and Wentworth in Persuasion is so brilliant and beautiful. The story is that they were in love with each other when they were 18, and she is basically persuaded, that's why it's called Persuasion, not to marry him, that she could do better, basically. And
Okay.
then he goes away for 8 years, uh, and it's sort of the equivalent of if one of your friends, went to Hollywood and became a star in the Marvel movies or whatever. But he goes off to sea and becomes a very successful uh, naval captain in the Napoleonic Wars, and is a real hero, and comes back to England really rich and really successful. And through a series of uh, accidents, comes back into her life, and she thinks, I mean, he thinks she's not interested because she dumped him 8 years ago, and she thinks he's not interested because she dumped him 8 years ago. But they're still crazy about each other, and seeing that um, journey where they slowly work out who the other one is and how they've changed over that 8 years. They're not the same people they were 8 years before. Uh, I think is still very interesting today and very relatable and very
Mm.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
love
I
that
think
show.
it's yeah, I think it's great because you see that happen with Shakespeare as well. People taking the kind of typical Shakespearean kind of thing, the big costumes, the elaborate
Yeah,
stuff, the 16th or 15th, 16th, 17th century
yeah,
kind of look in a way, but and just going, oh, we're getting up in costumes, we're doing Shakespeare, we have this lovely language. It's like, yeah, but
mhm.
what's it actually about? And I think
Yeah,
I don't mean to speak for you or anything, but I think a lot of people in the arts, when they put something on, whether it's directing, an art exhibition, was and anything to do with art in general, I think the last thing they want is some people just to walk out and just be like, yeah, how was it? Me, and they just
yeah,
don't really get anything from it. It's just like, yeah, anyway, who's hungry? And it's like, then they go and, immediately it's forgotten. Whereas, I think, but what you've done very well here is that like you say, you've stripped it all away from, like people say, oh, we're going to see Jane Austen. Oh, we're going to see some people in big hats and,
yeah, yeah,
riding horses going, oh, my estate is worth 10 times more shillings than you'll ever have in
Yeah,
your lifetime. So it's like, oh, well, my horse is called Jeffrey. I don't know. It's just like, yeah, and like these really kind of pompous kind of, it's almost like a like satirical kind of look at what the upper classes get on.
yeah. But I
Like,
think it's just become a cliche, hasn't it? Like, I think
yeah,
that's what
yeah.
you realize reading her novels is that like actually when she does it, when she first was writing it, it was revolutionary. But in terms, it really was in terms of form. She was basically invented this thing called free and direct style, where you're both in the third person and getting into people's heads in this really direct way.
Mm,
Um, and then you have 200 years of it being read over and over again, and people thinking they know what it is without reading it, and it being adapted in lots of different ways, and it loses that shock of the new. And I think what I was trying to do was to bring that back a bit.
mm. Yeah,
And I think absolutely what you say about the experience, I think it's such a big thing to ask people to come and go and sit in the dark and watch something and spend their evening doing that. But
mm,
you want it to kind of, really be startling and really shocking. And, what I really love is, this kind of startling visual experience that doesn't look like the real world and isn't like something they can see on TV and is, really live and immediate.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very good lead on to your other writer and director project, Winter's Tale.
Yeah.
Funny enough, talking about Shakespeare and all that stuff, but actually you've done something very similar. You've stripped it back to the language and put it in a very modern setting. From what I've seen about it, you put it in this world of social media and web presences, and dare I say it, AI and all that kind of
Mhm.
thing. About the I think someone called it just a Shakespeare's original play, the wildest and most unpredictable, because you
Yeah, he
never.
has a quote from me. Yeah, yeah. That's why I said in the
Oh yeah, of
marketing.
course that was you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but and I think and you're absolutely right, because Winter's Tale is just it's like a lot of Shakespeare. It's people say one thing and then turn to the audience and say another thing. Like Leontes is going, oh, like, his family is like, oh, I love you. You're one of the most amazing things that ever happened to me. Turns to the audience and goes, they're fucking against me, and it's like,
Yeah.
and it's brilliant in that. And it's like, again, you bring all
It's a
the things
it's an
together.
absolutely wonderful play, I think, The Winter's Tale.
Oh
I
yeah, absolutely.
loved it for a long time. And it was the third time I directed it, actually. I directed a student. I've directed two student productions. I directed it when I was a student with other students in. And then a few years ago, I directed it at Mountain View. And I do think it is absolutely extraordinary. And the way, the way that you feel that Shakespeare is at the end of his career. He's written, Hamlet and Macbeth and all these incredible plays,
Mhm.
and he just doesn't give a fuck anymore. He just doesn't care. Like he just knows he can do whatever he likes, and he knows that anything can happen in a theater. And I think the only so the so my version is called Winter's Tale, and it's
Mm.
about this guy called
Yeah, yeah.
Leo Winter, um, who is a tech billionaire in the mold of Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. Um, and and what I've done is written a new play basically. So it has the DNA of Shakespeare's play in it, and there's lots of some of the scenes are quite similar, some of them are quite different, but it's its own thing, I hope. Um, the only text from Shakespeare I kept intact is this speech at the beginning of Act 4 where time is like personified. So Father Time or Time comes on stage
Mm.
and says, we're going to move the action forward 16 years. Uh, and that is such a bold, crazy thing to do because, there's this idea that from Aristotle that like a play, which no one follows, but like that a play should just take place within 24 hours, that you should have this unity of time. Um, and certainly having just like this 16-year gap in the middle of a play is radical. It's really radical.
Mm.
And I love that a character comes on and says, "I'm time, and this is what we're going to do," and that seems to me such a kind of bold gesture to say, just to say we can do whatever we like in this theatre.
Mm.
There's this quote I really love from Ionesco, where he says that theatre is the place where you can dare to do anything, but so often people don't dare at all.
No,
Like, like anything can happen in the theatre. It's
yeah,
like
yeah,
it should
they
be
can play
this.
it safe too much. Yeah.
I really think so, and I think it can be this space of magical possibility. Um, but I love that the way Shakespeare is playing with form in this play and with
Mm.
genre. That like it's got this very tight kind of tragedy in the first three acts where
Yeah.
Leontes loses his mind and believes that his wife is having sex with his best friend, and that therefore the baby they're about to have is his friend's daughter and not his. Um, and then as soon as that tragedy kind of ends, Shakespeare has this very famous scene where someone gets eaten by a bear.
Mhm.
And that's like so fun that you're moving very quickly from this dark story to this very silly moment. And it must have been silly then. Like
Oh, yeah.
there's no way of staging that moment that isn't quite silly. And I think
Yeah.
that really has always appealed to me, that pushing together, as I was saying earlier, of things that are quite dark and also very silly, and being playful and funny as
Mm.
well as taking things
Yeah.
serious. I really connect to.
Yeah.
So I absolutely love the play. And coming back to it last summer. So I was kind of I was in a really lovely position with the Dallas Theatre where they were basically saying they wanted me to do a show, and then we were working out together what that show would be.
Hmm.
Where often it's not that way around. Often like you're pitching an idea for a show, and then the theatre will take that on. But we were talking about various different texts, and we talked about the Winter's Tale and decided on the Winter's Tale. Um, and I read it again, and I found it really interesting going back to it. As I say, I knew it quite well, but I was this time last year, or it was a bit earlier, I guess. I was expecting the birth of my second child.
Mm.
My partner was pregnant, and I realized, or I sort of thought for the first time about what Leontes' experience is at the beginning of that play, that he
Yeah.
is expecting his second child, and he loses his mind in this way. And I thought it was really interesting that Shakespeare chooses it to be the second child, because you could easily make the story that it's their first child. So he's going into fatherhood for the first time and goes bonkers. But it's not. And I wondered, what is it? Is there something that's happened with the first child that's been a very difficult experience, whether in terms of the birth or in terms of postnatal depression, or, all these different kind of problems that can happen when a baby is born? And I think I felt like, oh, maybe there's something terrifying for Leontes about going back into this experience. And that was partly because I was feeling some terror of going back into that experience, because I think having a little baby is something. It is in lot, I think people also overemphasize how hard being a parent is. I think my main feeling about being a parent is it's really fun and really exciting. But it is quite grueling, those first few months of having a baby, mainly because you don't get to sleep very much.
Yeah.
And I wondered, like, is there something for Leontes that he's going back into that, and he's scared of that? And so I wasn't that interested in the sexual jealousy thing,
Mm.
because it seemed to come so much out of the pregnancy, actually. So I thought maybe what he's doing is he's finding a reason why he doesn't have to be the father of this baby. He can't deal with the idea of having a baby again. So he's saying, oh, it's not my baby. It's my friend's baby. I don't have to look after it.
Mm.
And that the more I pursued that idea, the more productive it felt. And it felt really useful. I don't know. I actually don't know how much that comes across in the final play, but that was my idea as I was writing it. But then I was thinking, well, even if I have this kind of connection to Leontes there, it couldn't be someone like me, because the point in in the Shakespeare play is that he's a king and he's able to pursue this idea, this mistaken idea that his friend is the real father until it totally destroys his life.
Mm.
Um, and you have to be really powerful to do that. And I was then thinking about who are the people who have that kind of king-like power today.
Mm.
And they're tech billionaires, basically, who have power that is sort of almost above the law.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd been interested. So that show, Coppelia, is also about a tech billionaire. So it was a world I'd kind of done some research into and been interested in. It's something I've been interested in, as lots of people are, for a long time. I do think like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk are really interesting figures. Um, so I thought making Leontes into this character, Leo Winter, who's running a tech company, who's got kind of everything, and then totally ruins his life because of this mistaken idea that his best friend is the real father of the baby. That felt
Mm.
really useful.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things about the Winter's Tale is it's sort of two different plays, or it's two worlds. So you have the first part that is in the court of Leontes in Sicilia, and then after 16 years, you meet the little baby who's been born, who in Shakespeare's play gets put on the side of a mountain and left to be like eaten by the wolves, but is found by a shepherd and is brought up by shepherds in this land called Bohemia. And I had this idea that the Bohemia could be a metaverse, like a world a bit like Roblox or Minecraft, that Leo is developing, and that the baby could get plugged into that world and grow up online, basically.
Okay.
One thing I really noticed reading the Shakespeare play was that in that Bohemia section, everyone is in disguise. So Perdita, the grown-up baby, is dressed as like a princess, but she's also is really a princess, but she's like a princess who thinks she's a shepherdess dressed as a princess. And there's this prince, Florizel, who's in love with her, who's dressed as a shepherd. And then the king of Bohemia, Polixenes, turns up and he's dressed as a shepherd. So all these people are like in disguise and not who they really are. And there's also this character Autolycus, who's kind of a trickster, the scammer. And he also keeps disguising himself. And I was thinking, where today is this space where everyone is in disguise, is not who they really are? And it's the internet, it's online. So
Mm.
online, you can easily
Yeah.
create another personality, another identity.
Oh yeah.
So when they go, so in the story, the little baby gets sort of plugged into this metaverse world and grows up inside that. And then in the second half of the play, you meet her in this metaverse, and it's really fun because it's all on video. So in the same way that our lives now are all mediated, through a screen, as our conversation is now,
Yeah.
or the way all of so much of our experience of the world now is mediated through our phone screens.
Mm.
And so Rosanna Vise, who designed the costumes for this one, as well as the set, and I devised these kind of avatar heads. So the actors wear these big foam heads for there's like sort of maybe 3/4 of an hour to an hour where the audience don't see a human face. So it's quite extreme. So they're just
Wow.
wearing these big foam heads. And in order to understand who's talking, they have to do this kind of slightly weird, kind of brilliant robot, all sort of avatar video game kind of movement, which Lena Godina, the choreographer, created with me. And you're in this video game with them, and in my show, so the character who's called Perdita in Shakespeare is called Rose.
Mm.
Her problem is that she never leaves this computer game. So everyone else is like kids now are on Minecraft or Fortnite or Roblox and are kind of
Yeah.
playing on it a lot, but they're coming and
They can
going.
put it down.
She's
Yeah.
like, I'm the only person who doesn't get to leave. And her story is how she gets to leave the game.
Mm.
So and it's basically through, it's like Sleeping Beauty. It's through a kiss. It's through falling in love. but
Okay.
she's able to escape, and then she finds a way to break out of the game, and then at the very end of at the very last part of the show, she meets her father, and her father, Leo, who has destroyed, has pursued this mistaken idea, and his wife and his 4-year-old son die as a result of this.
Yeah.
And he's so broken by this and unable to deal with what he's done that he's actually living in a virtual reality that is a kind of simulation of his life if he hadn't done that.
Oh wow.
But she goes and visits him in this simulation,
Yeah.
uh, and gets to meet her mother. So her mother's really dead, but she gets to meet this kind of simulation of her mother in the final scene, which is in Shakespeare is this scene where there's Hermione as a statue who comes back to life.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Wow, that sounds incredible. Yeah. I mean, because and
it's
you
a really
did that.
fun show. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean it's a really good commentary on just well, it's so many things. It's bringing Shakespeare in, and of course you with all this social media and the virtual reality and everything,
yeah, yeah,
you're appealing to well, I was going to say appealing to younger audiences to introduce them to Shakespeare as well, but
yeah,
I think to everyone of all ages, particularly in the times that we live in now, like you mentioned there, like Elon Musk and you got Mark Zuckerberg who's in charge of Facebook, and you've
yeah.
got Steve Jobs who was created Apple and all that, and you've got people who can like I'm not sure if you saw, but in recent weeks, Apple just released their own big new virtual reality
No, I have
goggle,
seen. Yeah, yeah, and that was very
goggles.
much what I was
Yeah,
thinking about. Yeah.
yeah, and
What is this? Yeah, what is this kind of virtual reality world we're heading into? Yeah.
yeah, and there's a playing between what can we see, well, going forward, actually, what will we see? Will we all see virtual reality? Will we actually see the reality that we've got now? And hopefully it's the latter. We keep focusing on the
Yeah,
natural
yeah.
reality that's in front of us right now.
But there are
Um,
also the question, there are questions we've been talking about in theatre as well about what is reality. It's like very similar territory. Yeah.
yeah, it's absolutely. But yeah, it's and I think you see a lot of like comparisons between like, and of course I mentioned in the intro there your working relationship with Ivo Van Hove
Mm.
as well, because I see a lot of parables in your work. I think Ivo is a lover of tech and technology as well. He's done a lot
Yeah.
of shows which involve I think it was All About Eve at the National. You got the massive screens, and same for oh, what was that show he directed with Bryan Cranston? The one about the
That was Network. That was at the National.
network. Yes, yes. But yeah, it's also. But we'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, it's an interesting parallel because you're bringing in. So you're also showing human beings what reality could potentially be going forward. And of course, like with these
Yeah.
big new goggles and everything, 3.5 grand. So I won't be buying
Yeah,
one. Thank you very much.
yeah.
But I'm also not interested, even if you gave it to me for free. But it's all about where society's going in a way, and also you're showing how even Shakespeare and stuff can be pulled into all that as well. So it sounds like a really really fascinating show. I'd love to see it. Of course, you said it was on at the Dales Theatre in Latvia,
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
it?
the Diners Theatre in Riga. And what's
Yeah.
great about working in that model is that it's like, as most major European theatres are, it's an ensemble theatre with a repertoire. So they
Okay.
have a group of actors who are employed full time. So there's 40 actors working at the Diners Theatre, and they're basically, as I understand it, most of them will just work there for life. So they just work there. And that means that obviously in the UK, a show will do a run of like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. And then it closes. Um, at the Diners Theatre, and as I say, in lots of theatres in Europe, they will just have it in the repertoire, and then they will be able to do it like a few times a month. So they over a week they would do maybe 5 or 6 different shows in their
Mm.
theatre, and they have big crews who amazingly, will take the set down and put a different set up in the morning, and the actors will have I don't know, maybe 15 different shows in their heads that they know, and they're just doing different ones every night. So what was brilliant about that is how match fit the actors were.
Mm.
Because often in this country, you might be working with someone who hasn't done a play for a few years, which is often because they've had like a very successful like TV and film career, for
Yeah, yeah,
example.
yeah.
Um, I remember for example, Mark Strong, when he did A View from the Bridge,
Yeah.
Evo's production that I was the associate on, he hadn't done a play for maybe 12 years or something. And so it was a real coup getting him to be in that show.
Yeah.
And it's one of the best performances I've ever seen. But there is always like just a feeling of like, but I think just for the actor of like getting ready to be on stage again. So these actors in Riga, they were doing a show every evening as I was rehearsing. So they were just absolutely on top of their relationship with the audience and with the stage, and obviously they know the theatre so well because they're there every night. So
Yeah.
it's whereas almost always, when you're doing a play here, the actors are like getting used to like where the wings are and how it works backstage and stuff. But there's none of that because they're just like they just live there.
Yeah.
So that was really great. But it depends a bit on. I mean, the Winter's Tale has had really great reviews, had really great response from the
Yeah.
Latin press.
It's gone down really well, mate. Really, really.
So I'm hoping that it will stay in the repertoire for a year or maybe a few years. Would be the dream. So just come in and just be played 2 or 3 times a month.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's lots of time for you to go to Riga and go and see it. Is all I'm saying.
Of course, yes. Is there any chance you're going to be slightly more local, like London?
Well, I would absolutely love to do it in English in the UK. And I'm certainly trying to start those conversations to try and find a way of doing that. So
yeah. So was it in, obviously it's a silly question, it was in Latvia?
It was in Latvian, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
okay.
it was so I was like, when I wrote the rehearsal draft, they translated all of that. And then as I was changing it in rehearsal, the translator was having to translate it.
Okay.
Luckily, most of the actors spoke really perfect English.
Oh, good.
One of the actors didn't speak English at all, because there's a real generational divide in Latvia, where older actors are much more likely to speak Russian and younger actors are younger people are much more likely to speak English. So there was this brilliant actor, Indra Brika, who actually did that time speech in my show, and she didn't speak English at all. So all of my relationship with her was through my assistant director interpreting. But we still got on really well. So that was
good. Yeah. So you're Latvian.
She was, and there was this, one of the things. So she had the Winter's Tale isn't done that much in London, really, but it hadn't been done. It basically had been done in Latvia, I think about 50 years ago.
Oh wow!
And Indra had played Perdita when she was in her early 20s, I guess, and now she's in her 70s. And I really loved that connection with like the last time this play had been performed in Latvia, and so she did that time speech where this personification of time comes on stage, and says we're moving forward 16 years. And the way we did that, Jakub Lek is the video designer, and we created this sequence where we filmed Indra giving the speech, and we used AI to manipulate her image so that she's in her 70s, but we manipulated her at the beginning so she looked 20 years older. So she looked like a really very old person.
Wow.
And as she spoke the speech, over 2 minutes, she got younger and younger. So by the end of the speech, she looked like she was sort of in her 20s again.
Wow.
And Jakub I mean, I think it nearly killed him because it was so labor intensive, but he basically manipulated each frame of the video to like a specific year so that you had this feeling of like moving backwards through time, and as I said, this kind of sense that anything can happen in theatre and we can be move back and forth through time in that way. But yeah, it's a really special moment, actually.
Yeah, fascinating and scary at the same time.
Yeah. No, it was amazing watching Indra watch it for the first time because we manipulated her image, and obviously I wanted to make sure that she was happy with that.
Of course.
And she said, "Oh wow, now I know what I'm going to look like when I'm really old."
Yeah, I look forward to that one.
Exactly. Yeah.
But so your Latvian must be on point by now, right?
It's really not. I have to say, it's really not. I mean, I was really spoiled because they all speak such good English and everything was interpreted for me. I could basically say thank you and good morning, and that's it.
Okay, that's good.
I mean, I understand like some of the words that kind of get repeated a lot during the show. I could pick up on and remember, but I can't say anything in Latvian. I can't.
Yeah, this is sort of like Russian, isn't it?
It's
Latvia.
not actually.
What's that?
It's apparently it's in quite a small group of languages. Just I think it's Latvian and Estonian are in this group on their own. But
Mm.
also, if you're Latvian, you can't understand anything in Estonian, apparently. So it's a
Okay.
so no, I think it's quite specific and quite unusual as a language. So yeah, quite
Yeah.
impactful, I found.
Yeah. So yeah, well, you said that you wanted to try and bring this to to England, to London.
I
I
would
mean,
love that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, is do you think obviously it's a bit early to sort of say now, but do you think in a maybe in a couple of years that is something that could like a concrete
I,
possibility that it could happen?
I mean, I think the fact that it's been a big success in Latvia makes it much more likely,
Oh
obviously.
yeah,
I
sure.
think there is, I just don't know. And I think that audiences would really love it, actually.
Mm.
I
It
guess
sounds
I
fascinating.
guess
It really
I
does.
don't know how much people like people running theaters would be up for this idea of totally rewriting Shakespeare. Like I think
Mm.
that is a bit illegal in the UK. I think I was able to do it more easily because I was working in Latvia and they don't have the same relationship to Shakespeare. And obviously it had to be translated anyway.
Mm.
So I that kind of acted as a spur to me to do a more radical act of translation. Um, but I would absolutely love it to be on in the UK, definitely.
Yeah, I look forward to it, man. I look forward to
Yeah.
it. So, so we sort of talked about your writers, producers, and that kind of thing. But I
Yeah.
noticed, I wanted to quickly ask you about your role as a dramaturg as
Oh
well.
yeah.
Well, first of all, and specifically your dramaturg role in Richard II, that was on the Almeida with Simon Russell Beale.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, what exactly is a dramaturg? What is it?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think of it as somebody who is not what's really good about and James Yateman, who's been a frequent collaborator of mine, was the dramaturg on Winter's Tale.
Hmm.
And what I think is really useful is having someone who's really brilliant and really talented, who isn't plugged into the stress of being the director.
Mm.
So obviously, as the dramaturg, you do get stressed sometimes, but really, I think part of your role is to be a little bit removed from the hurly-burly of it and be able to kind of take a slightly wider view and be a bit more of an outside eye. And I think often a dramaturg won't be in rehearsal every single day. I mean, I think on Richard II, I was in rehearsal 2 or 3 days a week. Um, so you're not kind of necessarily seeing every moment of rehearsal, but you are able to as I say, take a slightly wider perspective. And I think your big responsibility as a dramaturg is for structure and storytelling, actually.
Mm.
So thinking about how is meaning being created in this show, what is the structure of it, um, and talking to the director and the writer, if there is one, about what you think is being created and how meaning could be shaped. Um, so you're there to kind of stand up for the story, I think. And one of the things I really enjoy in probably all of the roles I do in theatre, um, is kind of that opening up the bonnet of a story and working at what's making it tick and what's slowing it down a bit and how could you make it tick along a bit more nicely. And on Richard II, I was working very closely with Joe Hill Gibbons, the director, as we prepared for rehearsal and
Yeah.
thinking about what the story should be. And in that production, actually, we changed the text a lot. We changed the text quite a lot more, I think, than the critics noticed. So we cut a lot of it.
Mm.
And I was sort of leading on that, I think, working with Joe. Um, but I wrote quite a lot of new lines. that sort of sounded like Shakespeare, but definitely weren't Shakespeare. So if you, you know, particularly if you'd have like this section here, you wanted in this section, and you wanted to cut this bit in the middle, you need a couple of lines to kind of join them together.
Mm.
And I also brought in some text from other places. So there's this brilliant speech from Henry the Fourth, Part Two, I think it is, where the character Bolingbroke, who's in Richard II, becomes Henry the Fourth, and he's got this great speech about uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And we just thought that speech was really good, so we just put it in our play. So it's really manipulating the text in that way. But the text, you know, the text is only ever a means of creating meaning on stage, I guess. So you're thinking about how is meaning being created in that way. But it was no, I thought I'm really proud of that show, Richard II. I thought Joe did a great job with it, and I thought Simon Russell Beale was extraordinary in that part, actually.
Yeah, is this plagiarism? I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, is it kind of, well, no, it's not really, I suppose, but yeah. As the thing that jumped out at me there was, have you plagiarized Shakespeare there? So, no, of course.
Well, I think Shakespeare can take it, can't he? I mean,
well, yeah, it's a 450-year-old text now. Exactly, I think there's been so many adaptations to it. But the reason why I bring it up is obviously I think you've kind of answered it there really. But how do you, because you've obviously you had this play Winter's Tale where you've adapted it and modernized the language and stuff. But on this one, you've got the actual Elizabethan text. You've actually got the raw 450-year-old material that's there from the first folio. How do you work with I suppose how do you work with Shakespeare with all the rules, with the caesuras, with the iambic pentameter and all that stuff? How do you approach it?
I think my feeling about all that stuff is that people can get really kind of confused by it and thrown by it and anxious about it. And that actually, if you just say the words in the order in which they're written, then the whatever rhythm is there, whatever will come out. And I think, it's quite good if you can try and work out what it means up to a point. But I think if you say the words, I don't think you need to worry. I really think as an actor, as a director, like understanding what a caesura is, I just don't know if that's like a useful thing to be talking about. I mean, I think I do understand, but
it's like just a pause in the middle of a line. That's it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, well, there's probably going to be a comma there, and probably if you're reading something out loud and there's a comma, you would do a little pause there. So I find some of that kind of verse speaking technique unhelpful, and I would say sometimes kind of pushing actors into a slightly mannered kind of acting voice kind of way of speaking Shakespeare, which I find quite removed from my experience of the world. I mean, I haven't seen it actually because it's quite hard to get tickets, isn't it? But from reading about that, the Jamie Lloyd Romeo and Juliet, I don't know if you've seen that.
With Tom Hollander, no,
so
I haven't.
I think quite a lot of that is spoken in quite like quite a contemporary, like modern London English kind of way, which I did see. I did see the what was that play? Cyrano de Bergerac, which similarly
with James McAvoy,
exactly, which had had a similar kind of very contemporary way of speaking. I thought that was really done well.
That was very good. I saw that.
I think if they found a similar way of speaking Shakespeare, that's really good. And I think it should sound more like how we speak now than trying to find a kind of rarefied, mannered way of speaking, because I think that just distances us. And I felt making Winter's Tale that I was very clearly creating alienation techniques, as Brecht would say, for the audience. That the experience was mediated through a video screen, that they were wearing these big foam heads so you couldn't see their faces. But I still think that saying the Elizabethan Jacobean verse is more alienating than either of those things.
Mm,
Because I think it's so, and I love these plays. I do really love the poetry of it, the way it's written. I think it's incredible, and I've spent a lot of, you know, more than average time in my life reading them and thinking about them and enjoying them. And I'd be sad if nobody staged them in the original verse. But I
mm,
also think it's amazing that basically it's illegal to do what I did in Latvia and stage them not in the original verse. Because I
mm,
think the stories are so good and the structure of the plays are so good and the ideas they contain are so compelling and interesting.
mm.
I think finding other ways uh, to bring them to the stage is really important, actually.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
So I would, yeah. So it would be, I would, as I was saying earlier, I would absolutely love to do my version on the English stage. And there's, and I'm
Yeah,
not the only person who's doing this. There was this very good show, Teenage Dick, that was at the Donmar Warehouse a few years
yeah, I've
ago,
heard of that. Yeah,
which was a contemporary version of Richard III, set in a high school in America, which I really enjoyed. But I think we could see a bit more of it.
yeah. Well, I'm sure you'll get it over here. I'm sure
Yeah,
it'd
great.
be.
I hope so. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, of course you will, man. Yeah, I'll be the first one there. But it's great. I know we're slightly pushed for time. I know you got to shoot off and do other things, but just got a few more things left
Of
for you,
course.
Jeff. So first of all, I just want to quickly mention your working partnership, of course, with the great Ivo Van Hove as well,
Yeah.
who's his work I've admired for many years. You did Hedda Gabler at the National and A Little Life recently, which I've spoken to about the show, and amongst many, many other things. What's your experience of working with Ivo?
I had a really brilliant time working with Ivo. I'd really admired his work for a long time before I met him, and I he'd had he had a couple of shows that came to the Barbican before he became sort of really well known in this country. And I saw a show called the Antonioni Project, which had a really interesting use of video in it, I thought, and there was lots of kind of form. Although I think he would agree that the show itself didn't fully cohere. There was lots of very interesting ideas in it, and as a result of seeing that, I went to Amsterdam a couple of times to see his work uh, and really connected to it. And I think, you know, the things I'm talking about trying to make theatre for now and make it contemporary, I think that was what I was really recognizing in his work and enjoying in his work. Um, and shows like Roman Tragedies, I think, is an absolutely extraordinary production, which sort of mashes together three Shakespeare Roman plays, like Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and finds a kind of contemporary political media landscape context for it.
Mm.
And I thought have you seen that one? I'd really try and see that one if you can. They
Yeah,
still do it sometimes in Amsterdam. I think that's absolutely amazing, that show.
yeah. What was it called again? Sorry,
Roman Tragedies.
Roman Tragedies. Okay.
Um, so I'd been in really enjoyed his. There was a production of The Miser, which I saw in Amsterdam, which I absolutely loved, and also of Hedda Gabler, because he did that. He'd already done that before he came to the National. So he first did it at New York Theatre Workshop, and I saw the Dutch production of it. Actually, I saw it on this trip to Munich I had when so I don't know if it still happens, but back then the Young Vic used to send out small groups of like emerging directors or younger directors to different European cities to kind of meet people and see work. And I went on this trip to Munich, um, which was just like a week or something, maybe, or less. But I saw some work there that was really, really foundational to thinking about theatre, or my thinking about theatre. And one of them was Ivo Hedda Gabler. So I'd seen quite a few shows. And then out of that trip to Munich, the artistic director of the Residence Theatre in Munich said, so there were maybe 5 of us on this trip. And he said, if any of you want to come back and be an assistant director here, you could do that. We could try and make that happen. So then I decided I would try and make that happen,
Mm.
and got a job as what they call a what do you call it? Actually, I can't remember what it's called in German. It's like an intern director, is what it
Mm.
means.
Yeah.
So I was like the intern director on this show at the Residence Theatre, and that was such a foundational experience for me actually, because I spent 2 months living in Munich, and because both that in Munich there are two really big theatres and a few smaller theatres, and because the two big theatres each had a repertoire system, like I was talking about, they have in Latvia. They just do different shows every night. So I was
Mm.
able to see like 40 different productions or something that
Wow.
they'd made over, several years, but they would change them every day. So I mean now even because until recently the National Theatre had a sort of mini rep where they would do a couple of shows off for a week, on for a week, and now they just do straight runs. I think even at the National Theatre here.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so if you come to London, you can only really see three shows at the National Theatre,
Mm.
even if you're here for 2 months potentially. Whereas, so in Munich, I was able to see like 40 shows. I got to see all of these different um, shows directed by all of the kind of major German directors, and it was such an education actually. What was really good as well is I was watching them not in English; they were in German. I didn't speak very good German, really very poor German. Um, and watching theatre and not understanding the text was so useful because I was thinking about how meaning was being created through the staging, through the emotion of the actor, and not through the text. And I think particularly coming from a British context where text is so foregrounded, and I did an English degree at Cambridge where there's this kind of real focus on text, which is very useful,
Mm.
but is I think not is I think one of the things that slightly constrains British theatre, I would say, this kind
Yeah.
of focus on the text. And I was so it was so useful to seeing work in this much more expressionistic tradition, but also not understanding the language. So I just couldn't really worry about text.
Yeah.
But in those 2 months I spent in Munich, as well as being the intern director on this show, Stiller, um, I realized that Ivo was in rehearsals at the other theatre,
Mm.
and so I was, one person who's been so important to me in my career is David Lann, who used to run the Young Vic,
Okay.
and he really, with Joe Hill Gibbons, really kind of turned me on to this stuff happening in Europe. David was the one who told me to go and see the Antonioni project. He said, "There's this guy Ivo. He's quite interesting. I think you might like him,"
Mm.
and I did. And he was right. And so I knew David knew Ivo. So I asked David, could he introduce me to Ivo and ask if I could go and see it in his rehearsals? So basically, I kind of truanted out of the rehearsals I was supposed to be in,
Mm.
and went and sat in Ivo's rehearsals instead. So I spent a week or two watching him rehearse, again in a language I didn't really speak. And I mean, I met him, but I didn't really talk to him very much at all then. Um, and that was really interesting, seeing how he worked and thinking about like what his kind of rehearsal style was like. And I think what's interesting about Ivo is that from his work, you might think that he's like very sort of interventionist and kind of making a lot of noise in rehearsal. And he's really not like that. He's quite quiet. He kind of goes up to the actors and has kind of quite private conversations with them individually. Um, he doesn't really enjoy at all actually talking to a big group of people, I don't think.
Okay.
So he won't. And often when I was then working with him as an associate, at the moments where you kind of did need to talk to the whole group of people, I would kind of do those moments where, when you're saying, "I'm really sorry, everyone, but we're going to have to cancel this performance," or stuff like that. Um, or kind of, "We're now at the end of this week of rehearsal, and this is where we're going." Um, I think, in some ways, I think Evo's, quite shy about those kind of moments. So it was interesting even then watching him and thinking that the style in rehearsal was quite different to how maybe I expected and maybe how other people expected, because the work is quite bold and muscular, but the style in rehearsal was a bit quieter. But anyway, having observed his rehearsals, then David Land had persuaded him to come and do a show at the Young Vic, which was A View from the Bridge. And
Mm.
then they were interviewing for the assistant director for that. And that's when I first properly spoke to him, I think. And we had this chat. He wasn't very used to, I think, interviewing for assistants, because in Amsterdam there would just be a group of people who were kind of employed by the building and they would just get put onto the show. Um, so he didn't really have much to ask or to say, and he just said, like, what have you seen my work? And I think I'd seen like 6 productions or something, which given he'd only had a couple of shows in the UK was pretty impressive, really, because I traveled quite a bit to see his work. And so I talked about the ones I'd seen, and I got the job off the back of that. And then we had a very good time working together on A View from the Bridge, and that's, a really special experience for me. And have you seen that show? I mean,
I did, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, that I think that is one of the best productions of the last, it's more than 10 years ago, I guess now, but of the last decade or so.
It was exceptional because
Yeah,
I saw it via the broadcast because I didn't manage to
yeah,
get a ticket, but it was even through the cinema screen, you could tell it was something very, very
yeah,
special. Yeah.
yeah, and it really changed my life, that show, because I ended up working on it. I mean, for 4 years or something, because it went to lots of different places. It went from the Young Vic to the West End and Broadway with basically the same cast, and then we did it with totally different casts in Chicago and Los Angeles and Paris. And with Chicago and Los Angeles, Ivo wasn't around for those rehearsals, really. So I was just leading on those rehearsals and making that show. And the show is so well done and so precisely directed. And I think that was a very useful training for me as a director to just repeatedly recreate that show and think about the ways on quite a bare stage. It's this white box with this white floor with a black bench around it, and this big black box that starts down and then lifts up, as if Jan Sveveld used to talk about, as if you're lifting up a rock on the ground and looking at the kind of insects and creepy crawlies underneath, and then you put the rock back down at the end of the show.
Mm.
Um, but I think for me, working on that and thinking about how meaning is created through that staging was pretty foundational, actually. Yeah. And
Mm.
when I did that show, I thought I'd said to myself and to the people around me that would be the last show I assisted on. And then
Mm.
I ended up working with Ivo a lot, and then as an associate director, which is a slightly different role and has more power, I suppose. But I kept doing shows with him, and I really enjoyed them. And I I I think more than any other director I worked with in that kind of capacity, he gave me a lot of power in the room, and
Mm.
I felt like I was, doing useful work. Um, and several of the shows that I worked on with him, I think, were really exceptional.
Mm.
Yeah, View from the Bridge, Hedda Gabler, and A Little Life as well. I think, really very excellent work.
Yeah, and yeah, just very quickly, like A Little Life. I've talked about this that show before, and on here as it's you create really spectacular work, and that show in particular, about Judith and Francis, the trauma that he had and everything. It still sticks with me even now. But so many people just really
Well,
got.
I hadn't worked with Evo for a few years, actually, before I did that one last year. Uh,
Okay.
and that was just because I wanted to focus on my own work. I
Mm.
really enjoy working with Evo, but he's so busy and has so many different shows that if I kind of did all of his English language shows, that would just be my whole calendar, really. I wouldn't have time to do anything on my own. So I'd sort of, a few years ago, I sort of said that I wasn't going to work with him anymore, so that I could prioritize my own work. And then I don't know, 18 months ago or something, he asked if I wanted to work on Little Life. And I'd seen it in Amsterdam and thought it was a very exceptional production. I think the book is very interesting. I think what Ivo and Jan did with it is really
Yeah.
great, actually. And so I agreed to do that because I thought it was such an exceptional production.
Yeah, it really was, mate. It really, really was. I just got two more questions for you,
That's
Jeff.
fine. Yeah, yeah.
You okay?
Yeah.
Actually, three. Just do one very quick one, just before we get to the last two. Obviously, you've got your shows going on at the moment. You know, Winter's Tale and
Yeah.
all that stuff. You know, bring it to London. What's what stories do you want to tell in the future? What shows would you like to
Well, I'm
tackle?
just starting. I have just got a commission, which I maybe can't say what the actual title of it is, but
Okay.
it's so I've got to start working on that quite soon. And that's another early 19th century novel by a woman, after
Mhm.
like, as well as Persuasion, but it's quite different to Persuasion.
Okay.
But so yeah, I'm beginning, and it also, like Jane Austen, there's a kind of really clear way people have of thinking about this novel, which I'm kind
Yeah.
of very interested in exploding and subverting.
Yeah.
But
Cool.
yeah, so that's great. So I've got a commission from a theatre, um, and I'm going to start writing that. Hopefully, that will be on next year.
Cool. Well, you heard it here first, guys. You
Yeah.
heard it here first. So, yeah, last couple of questions for you, Jeff. What would you say was a bit of advice that you wish you heard when you were starting out?
I think the advice I often say to people starting out is just try and enjoy it as it happens, because it can be so frustrating. It's so easy to get frustrated, I think, at all points in your career. Like, and this doesn't change, unfortunately. It's easy to feel like, oh, I wish I was doing more. I wish I was more successful. I wish I had um better projects or a project or something to do. And it can be, it can be frustrating and lonely, and it's a long old journey, I think, working in theatre and being an artist. Um, but my advice is just try and enjoy it as it's happening, and
Mm,
enjoy the life you're actually living, rather than trying to think about an imagined better life that you could be having. And it's hard because there's always going to be people who are more successful than you, who you can compare
yeah.
yourself to. Um, but I think if you're choosing to do this, to go on this road, um, you've chosen that, and just enjoy what's there to enjoy. And, I think there were times in my career where I was very frustrated about not having more work or not having opportunities. But actually what I was doing was fun and interesting. And I think I could have enjoyed that a bit more. But I think that's something I really try and focus on, because you can't control what opportunities come to you. I mean, these days, all I really care about is getting opportunities to make work at scale.
Mm,
And I'm happy to go to Riga for that. So I'm not kind of thinking about a specific trajectory or working at specific theaters, because I think you get very frustrated that way. But
mm.
I do. I'm not saying I don't get frustrated, but I think it's just trying to enjoy your life as you live it.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And I think, yeah, just enjoy stuff. Yeah, like you said, it can get a bit lonely, a bit isolating sometimes, but ultimately, just know that I think it's from Game of Thrones. They always say that the night is always darkest before the dawn. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
just keep going, and you never know what's around the corner, and just trust that, the universe, whatever it is, the timing, that everything's working out. But in the meantime, just keep doing what makes you happy, and
Yeah, and find ways to make work, like
exactly, yeah.
at whatever scale you can, really. Like,
Exactly, exactly, yeah. And finally, today, what would you say was an experience or experiences you've had in your career up to this point that you're never ever going to forget?
um, oh, it's a good question. I think, I do think the kind of creative intensity of making a show can be is sort of just like no other drug, really. It just can be so enthralling. I think I mean there's lots of things I could say. I think maybe I'd say making Persuasion for the first time in Manchester in 2017, and this feeling of feeling that we were making something quite special and quite daring, but not having any idea while making it that it would be the big hit that it has been, and that, it would have a future life and so on.
Yeah.
But just being like really bound up in that story, and that was a really fun show because everybody, I think almost everyone involved was like away from home and like living in Manchester and was like up for going out, and we had a really fun time. Um, but just the intensity of that story and being bound up in that story, and it had like a very personal uh resonance for me, because it's about kind of choosing how you organize your life. And when I made it, I was going through a very difficult breakup and making some big choices about my life.
Mm.
And I think that show, I think, will always stay. I'm currently actually trying to get it to have another production. But I think, yeah, the kind of the intensity of making it, and the being in that group of people making it, and several of them are some of my best friends. Like particularly James, the dramaturg, and Morgan Runacre Temple, who choreographed that show. But all the creative team actually, and the actors. It was a really sort of close-knit bunch, and was a really special time. I think I will always treasure that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Jeff, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks so much for asking.
No, no, no. Thank you for your time. I'd love to do another one. I still got so many more questions for
Okay,
you
great.
about you mentioned your time at Cambridge, and actually when you said theatre, not in English, and when you're in Munich, I just thought,
Yeah.
because I mean, there's so many more questions. I'd love to ask you that. It would keep us here for another 2 hours, but yeah,
Oh, it's been
no.
great chatting, Oliver. Thank you very much.
No, no, thank you, thank
Yeah.
you. If you just hang on, I'll finish the recording, and we'll
Sure.
do a little debrief afterwards.
Yeah, of course. Great.
But yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been the Uncensored Critic podcast, and I'll be back very, very soon. And yeah, wow, brilliant, Jeff. Thank you so much, mate.
Yeah, my pleasure.